really had nothing to lose. My fallback is I just stay in the exact same position that I am in. I'm lucky where, because I'm quite young, I can take quite big risks.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Human After All. Today I am delighted to welcome Cosmo Denny. Cosmo Denny is the managing director of Iridescent Technology, the company behind Zavmo AI, an AI-powered learning companion that is designed to make education more human, more personal, and adapts around your unique learning needs. At just 22 years old, Cosmo is leading teams, shaping technology, and reimagining what learning could look like in the age of AI. Cosmo, welcome.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Fantastic. So for people who might not know you or Zavmo AI yet, how do you describe what you do and how do you describe what Zavmo AI actually is?
Yeah, so I'm the CTO of Zavmo, so I do all the tech behind the company. And Zavmo itself is a personalized learning companion that allows people to take high quality assessments and sort of compliance things like job descriptions to national occupation standards, channel that into what people really want to learn. So channeling their vision, understanding the gaps between where they currently are and where they want to go, and then personalizing a learning pathway to get people to sort of deliver real outcomes. And so sort of what I always say, I always feel like we need to clarify what a real outcome is. And so that would be something anywhere from a business plan to a marketing strategy or to a general sort of end assessment in the form of an exam. The crucial thing is, how do we take what is a really good source of ground truth in the form of a job description, compliance, entrepreneurial mindset profile, disc profile, translate that into a really personalized sort of vision-based learning pathway that is totally personalized to the person, and then have a deliverable outcome that can be implemented in the real world. So maximizing ROI while sort of keeping ground truth and really good quality data at the core of what we do.
That is a quite remarkable step change from online learning at the moment. I mean, that is a very bold vision. When we first started talking about the Zavmo AI, journey, was just an idea about how to, from my point of view, making learning more human, and from your point of view, applying this whole new set of technology that was emerging, in the form of AI. It was a really bold vision. So what was that moment when you decided to pivot your entire life and jump in to this kind of bold new adventure?
Yeah, no. So at the time I was at university in Japan, and I was quite frustrated as I saw two things. You and I were chatting quite a lot in around what exactly is learning looking like. You said that there was something to do with AI. I was interested in AI. So with that, I think the sort of combination of being really frustrated with what actual learning is on an institutional level, doing university and things like that, not really seeing many outcomes in terms of what I would like to do, and also sort of seeing, being generally interested in AI and doing some programming on the side and things like that, just naturally led to a good step change. I think I always have to level into, when we started Zavmo, there weren't really agents. Crew AI had literally just come out, which was one of the first sort of big agent frameworks. And so our very first MVP of Zavmo was prompt changing based off a counter. So depending on how you would answer, you had a different prompt and things like that. And to look at then where we are now, sort of essentially 2 years later, the massive change in AI has been spectacular. It's just, how you can build out model context protocol servers, how you can look at just agentic frameworks that deliver things like type safety and just general memory safety with things like Pydantic AI. It's super awesome to look at it.
The question that the audience will be answering is, but you were 20 at the time, really young. I mean, and I understand that, you were frustrated with university, but I still think it was an incredibly kind of bold move. Now, cycle forward 2 years later, you're leading a global team of developers and engineers. And most people, absolutely do not have that kind of responsibility and do not take that kind of bold leap in their career. What do you think inside you made you think that you could do it, quite frankly?
Well, I think actually it was sort of more the opposite. Because I mean, if when you're at university, to a certain extent, you have a stipend that I was on a stipend that the university gave me. And so actually I really had nothing to lose, because I had nothing, I didn't even have a degree. I was just there. I knew that my accommodation was paid for. And so actually it wasn't a matter of how do you take the step. It's sort of how couldn't you? Because I have nothing to lose. My fallback is I just stay in the exact same position that I am in. And I think actually that's sort of generally how I try to treat a lot of these things. I'm lucky because I'm quite young, I can take quite big risks with very limited responsibilities. So yeah, I would say that's how it was less a bold move and more a move because I have nothing to lose, so to speak.
Interesting. So you're now 22, so cycle 2 years forward, and you're running, an AI company with, a global team. In terms of where you've come from and what has influenced you, you've obviously grown up surrounded by kind of big ideas, but I guess also, the fact that you've been influenced, by myself and,
Hmm.
your father,
Hmm.
living the idea of continual learning. How do you think, your family and your background have shaped, your bold actions in life, but also your vision of what education could be like?
Well, I mean, you're an entrepreneur, right? So I sort of grew up around you, and I think also I related to quite a lot at school, not necessarily just sort of finding education quite boring. I think that was the thing. Like I could apply myself to do stuff, but it's just quite boring otherwise. I think maybe that's a certain aspect of arrogance about me or something. I'm not sure, but like I think just finding things interesting and wanting to apply that into a more educative way. To be honest, I'm unsure, but I definitely know that you've influenced me a good amount, and I think just generally always being interested in business and building companies have been a sort of core source of that. With regards to education, I think that's sort of is yet to be solved, but I would say that I'm very curious about learning new things, and that's generally the drive to continue to work to a certain extent.
Yeah, very, 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 very interesting. I'm going to pivot now slightly. A lot of people, when we talk about the fact that we've got a data science team in India and the fact that you moved wholesale from Japan to India to lead the endeavors in India, they are, quite taken aback. So you find yourself, just turned 20, 21, you land in Bangalore and you're running data science team in a brand new country. What was going on in your head, and how was that adoption and adaptation process? How did it feel?
Yeah, it was pretty fun. I mean, I think India itself is having a massive technological boom, and I think what's really interesting about it is India itself is large enough to be totally its own market. Like looking at things like Swiggy and like all of these, yeah, well, Swiggy I think is the main one really, and not Alipay, can't remember. Anyway, PhonePay, sorry, and UPI, and it's having a massive boom, and it's its own market. And so what's interesting about India is they are having a massive technological boom, but not really solving global problems, or at least they're mostly solving Indian problems and not quite exporting them to Europe. And so I think where obviously you can charge 100 times the price. And I think for me, that's a really interesting thing to come across really intelligent, really smart people who are looking to solve problems that are just as valid, but the market pays 10 to 100 times less in India compared to Europe. And so just from a business point of view, it made a lot of sense. And also just from a personal development point of view, I think it's interesting. It reveals certain aspects to the extent that humans themselves are, all of us are incredibly similar, but there are just different ways in which we manage and communicate. And so I think being able to deal with that and develop those sorts of skills are also really cool and quite interesting.
And most people, to be honest with you, would not decide they were going to move to India. They just wouldn't do that. I know that you'd already had the experience in Japan, but was there anything like particularly difficult, strange between, packing up your stuff and moving to, let's say, Tokyo for your undergraduate versus, packing up all your stuff and arriving in Bangalore? Were there any differences? Because obviously that's, again, it's an awful lot for a young person to take on.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think generally I do hold the sort of the opinion that actually things are only hard if you make them hard. to a certain extent. You know, there's a decent amount of activation energy and sort of and like requirements to do any change. But actually, you know, you don't need to put too much thought into how difficult it's going to be. You may as well just do it. You know, same with AI and things like that. You know, thinking about the complexity and difficulty of it doesn't change the task itself. So, I don't know. I really enjoyed it. I think India's an awesome place. I've had the opportunity to, whilst we've been in the office, do some traveling around. And I really like the culture and the food. The only downside has been the spice inflation, which now means that European food is sort of marginally less tasty. But other than that, it's been great. I don't really have any complaints about it.
I still think it's kind of extraordinary that at such a young age you've lived in so many countries, you know, done so many things that I think for a lot of people would seem very difficult.
But these things have fallen into place. I would say it's definitely been an accident. You know, the original plan was to stay in London, and then sort of 5 countries later, here I am in India. So I wouldn't say there's any sort of wit or genius behind it. It's very much been an accident, but you know, a happy accident of that. So it's been quite cool. So yeah.
Okay, so let's go on now. I mean, we've spoken about, you know, how young you are and how much responsibility you've had with regards to creating a brand new product for, you know, a new market and brand new technology. As part of that journey, you have obviously had to manage people that are older than you and in lots of sense more experienced. So it could be more experience in, you know, learning and development, but generally, you know, you've been focused on the team, all of which have got bachelors, they've got masters, they've got, you know, years of experience. How did you lead that team without pretending you have all the answers? And what did it feel like?
Well, I mean, I think it's important to note that they're not just more experienced; they are just actually smarter than me. You know, I think like actually the team is really good. So I mean, I think the real fact of the manager is that I don't have any of the answers. I'm actually just a person asking questions, right? The one difference between a sort of core programmer or a sort of technical lead and the CTO is I need to look at the whole system architecture and design what problem we're actually solving, you know, and then also connecting with clients and chatting to them to see if that strategy sort of aligns with the customers that we're servicing. And so I think actually the real skill doesn't really come in knowing stuff, but more asking the right questions and sort of being curious to stuff. I mean, I think if you look at our cognitive load equation that we spent sort of like 3 to 6 months developing, that's just sort of ended up just being 10 lines of code. But actually what it was most of the time was Gaurav and I coming up with different ways in which we can calculate how stressed and fatigued people get through conversations. So that's looking at, you know, changes in focus, changing all these things. And none of it comes from sort of like raw ability, but just more sort of questions, you know, questions and research. I think that's sort of it. I wouldn't say I'm a particularly gifted programmer or anything like that, but I would say actually being able to ask the right question is probably a skill that as time goes on I've developed. And I think also, you know, age is a thing. It's not really a factor if you're continuously doing deliverables. You know, as long as I'm mapping and have the highest standards in the team, then I'm happy to sort of, you know, be the team lead, so to speak. So those are the two things: just asking questions and keeping standards really high, and making sure we as a team adhere to really good company culture of good quality code and fast and quick deliverables.
In terms of, everybody loves to say that, you know, AI is changing the world. You know, in our particular use case, you know, AI is changing education.
Mm.
But most of what we see just looks like kind of digital worksheets. It doesn't look like anything necessarily different. What do
Mm.
you think current EdTech is getting wrong about, you know, what we want to change in terms of Zavmo AI? Just tell us a little bit about, you know, the problems that we're trying to solve in the EdTech market.
Well, I think that's a really good sort of place to start. So what are the problems that we're trying to solve? And for Zavmo as a point, I would say it's personalization, meeting compliance at scale is the thing that we're trying to do. It's how do we build out an AI that just by scaling personalized education, you get a company to have really good quality infrastructure on learning about what skills people actually have and how they're learning. And so that's sort of it. That's what we're doing on Zavmo. But I would say just AI and EdTech and AI in general does suffer from new tech into an old market, whereby we're applying sort of what are old problems, and we're trying to apply a new tech into it. And you know, as you said, a lot of AI is just sort of modern day worksheets. So with that in mind, if you're looking to sort of solve any problem with AI, I think the first question that you should ask is what is the specific set of data that you're trying to use to solve the problem. So, for example, when it comes to Zavmo, we use nothing but national occupation standards, or we'll use Ofqual, or we'll use something like an entrepreneurial mindset profile. And all of this allows us to take really good quality ground truth, really good quality data, and then turn that into something that leads to a really awesome personalized outcome. Also, it means that just from a training point of view, we know everyone is starting off at the same point. And so I think with that, it provides us once again with a really good look at what the infrastructure of education is looking at. Because we can't sort of deny that when it comes to AI, there's been a major change in how people look at and process data. It was something that used to be very Excel based, or sort of something that was quite static and binary. But now with AI, we've sort of brought on a conversational aspect to a lot of it. And so being able to adapt things like XAPI and SCORM tracking into something that is more dynamic and crucially as well becomes more predictive is really awesome.
I think a lot of the people in our audience might think that AI means an LLM, i.e. kind of a conversational interface. And obviously the scary bit might be, well, how can you create learning from an LLM because it's not grounded in a source of truth? So can you just go through in a little bit more detail about how Zavmo is built in terms of the data and how we use the ingestion of data to ensure the integrity of how the LLM is creating learning? Because I think that would be useful.
Yeah, I mean, I think the best way that I always do it is sort of by reframing what Zavmo is, because everyone thinks Zavmo is an AI company, but on the tech side, we sort of deem it to be more of an infrastructural company, because the biggest thing that we've spent all of our time doing is building and scaling databases and recommendation engines to then feed to a large language model. So this isn't your sort of context engineering that has recently popped up, or your graph rag, but something that, how can we implement really good quality analytics and graph neural networks and other recommendation engines and recommendation databases to build out and support this sort of large language model. When we go through sort of what a large language model does in the context of Zavmo, really all it's doing is just turning what we know to be true from a static data point of view and translating it to the user's preferences. So we've already got sort of 211,000 units of learning, 24 years if you did nothing but learn. And what we do is figure out, okay, well, what is important to the user? How do we deliver that learning to them most efficiently? And then we will deliver those set of data and instructions to the large language model for translation. Because really, the biggest thing that we're trying to differentiate, and this is how or the strategy that we've taken to really scaling an AI company cost effectively, is how do you enable fine-tuning without actually fine-tuning a large language model, which is really expensive. You're like, well, actually, if we fine-tune the context and the total input into the AI, it will be far more effective. So how can we build out these recommendation engines, these sort of deep learning models to make our context better? That is far, far cheaper to train. It requires much less data. And crucially, we can actually have a much better look at the data itself because there's less data. So we can prune and be more efficient in what we're actually querying for. So to go back then to your point on how does Zavmo prevent hallucinations and how do we enable Zavmo to deliver really good quality content? And it's essentially because we strip all of the ability for creation away from the LLM and only treat it as Google Translate for learning.
Can you explain a little bit about how Zavmo makes learning more human, how it creates learning experiences that are deeply personal for our audience?
Yeah, so I think the biggest thing is asking questions, right? There is a lot of current LMSs and just general e-learning softwares software doesn't really ask good questions. And the biggest thing that we try to do is just make sure that we're asking questions, because generally the best sort of learning is something that's nearby to what you know. Because I think a lot of people look at learning as some sort of binary thing where you either have it or isn't, but it's actually more of a tree whereby you've got a central trunk of experience. And then as you branch off, you have different experiences that you then learn from. And so by Zavmo continuously asking questions, we can better figure out how close is this to what someone already knows, and how can we connect previous knowledge into it? As goes the famous, trick. If you're trying to remember someone's name, remember it in a triplet. So their name, their character, and then something about their face. And then generally, actually, it's much easier to remember that because it's more contextual rather than abstract. And so by asking lots of questions, we figure out more about the user, we figure out more about what they actually know, and then by seeing what they know and the gaps, we can make the learning far more contextual and human rather than textbook based, where it's more charismatic rather than charming. So what I mean is, charisma, you go to them, and charming, we go to you, right? Textbook is very charismatic in the sense you have to put in all of the effort to make sure that you're learning, and you have to try and figure out based off how the writer has written it. Whereas Zavmo is far more charming in a sense that we need to try and figure out how you work so then we can adapt the learning towards you.
So I guess the strapline, making learning as unique as you are, can you just explain a little bit about what that means in terms of the user experience?
I mean, I would sort of default back into it. It means that we're asking a lot of questions. So the first step is sort of trying to understand the vision of what actually we're trying to teach you. So whether that be based off taking your job description, whether that be based off taking a DISC profile or an entrepreneurial mindset profile or something like that, then connect that into, okay, out of these things, what is the most important thing for you to learn? Tell us why. We can then go and gather some sort of content for you, whether it be sort of based off engineering, whether it be based off sales, based off marketing. And then we can say, okay, so this is the content that we have. How can we personalize this to you? Would you like us to change how we talk to you? What to you would make this learning successful? What do you already know about it? And how can we take this to the next level? And with that, we can sort of ask some more questions and bring in a training needs analysis style approach, mapping it to, once again, some sort of taxonomy or some sort of way of leveling. But whether that be human based, so we're comparing you to other people in an organization as a sort of force curve, or whether it be something that is more Bloom's based, and we take, one of the 3 pillars of Bloom's taxonomy and build off that. The biggest thing as well that I would say in terms of how we really get the user to engage is within Zavmo, we have the highest order of knowledge isn't creation, it's actually teaching. And so if you really can achieve expert level knowledge, you should be able to teach Zavmo how to do something. And so yeah, and I would say we're relatively successful at that. I'm sort of pretty pleased. Our COO, Rick, famously built a website with Zavmo, and he doesn't know anything about programming. So to me, I'm quite happy with it. I think it serves a good purpose, and I think the biggest thing that we've really just tried to sort of ring around everything to do with Zavmo is curiosity is king. Just who are we to know how the user likes to learn? What we do know is we have massive infrastructure for education that is super scalable. And crucially, now our next step is to figure out what is important to the user and why.
So it sounds like it's very individualized, but by the same token, the data sets that you use or we use in Zavmo are not fixed. So, for example, if we were working with a corporate organization, we might use national occupational standards and we might use an off-call library. But you've also given us an example of how a university might utilize Zavmo. So could you explain how, on the one hand, the user always gets personalized learning, but then on the other hand, the data sets can be completely customized? How does that actually work?
So the data sets themselves aren't getting customized. They are sort of what we would deem your ground truth, so to speak. Like these are the things that are unchanging and will always be constant. When it comes to the user, how we get these adaptive learning pathways is just by bounding the start and the finish with set outcomes, and then leaving the middle to the user. So leaving the journey to the user. I always sort of discern it to, you know, how when you're in your car and you turn your sat nav on and it says this is the fast route, this is a beautiful route, this is the one with toll roads, this is the one without toll roads. The sat nav can figure out which pathway is best by asking those sorts of questions, and we do the same sort of thing. I think the big thing that I would say, if anyone is in education and wants to build out an AI solution, the biggest thing that I would start with is what sort of questions do we need to know in order to deliver really good quality learning? And then you're at a decision point, which is, are we going to answer those ourselves, or are we going to build the AI to ask those questions of the user? And so for us, we've drummed up a number of questions, which are, what is the problem that we're trying to solve? So scalable, personalized learning. What do we need for that? We need a lot of data. We also need to know what a personalized learning experience looks like, just to sort of dumb it down to those three. With that in mind, we then very quickly realized, okay, well, we can ask, okay, tell us the data that you want to give us, and we can then provide that. However, that doesn't really provide a super scalable solution, because the issue is that not everyone will have this data on hand. And so we were like, okay, well, we need to solve that problem. However, when it comes to a personalized learning experience, we can't necessarily solve that. So then the question is, okay, well, we'll have to ask the user to solve that one.
So where does the 4D process come in, and how does the 4D process allow that element of personalization? So let's say we have ingested national occupational standards, which we have, and we've ingested all of the education system in the UK, which obviously is available, throughout, Commonwealth countries that might lean to a certain extent on UK qualifications. That's great, but can you just explain a bit about the user experience in terms of the 4D process? How does that work? And how, a follow-up question would be, where is the content?
So how does it work? I would say in Discover, the first thing that we're trying to do is sort of understand what gaps you have and what you're trying to learn. Discuss, we're trying to channel what those outcomes mean. So we know now what do you want to learn. So what do the outcomes mean, and how do we get you as close to those outcomes as efficiently as possible? Then we deliver the content, and then we sort of get you to demonstrate that. So, with a real world outcome, ideally in the form of a marketing plan or sort of business plan or marketing strategy, sales strategy, something like that. Or whether it be an exam, or whether it be something like an oral exam based off cold calls, something like that. The idea is an actionable outcome based off known gaps. When it comes to where does this data come from, a lot of it just comes from us data scientists doing what we do best, which is sort of being on the internet and finding it and processing it. So that's sort of a core part to the Zavmo technology, building like scalable infrastructure for educational content, and crucially then being able to adapt all of this modern data into something that fits with AI really efficiently. And then crucially from there, making sure that it is backward compatible with existing infrastructures like a learning record store for an XAPI sort of based system, or making sure that we can take SCORM data from LMSs and implement it into our sort of data style.
So it sounds like you have almost taken the openness of an LLM and then constrained it with a number of different types of agents to ensure it does what you want it to do and not, for want of a better word, hallucinate. So it sounds to me like you've put learning theory and obviously a lot of clever tech in the form of agents in order to create and bind a set of standards, but also allow for every unique learner to have a different experience dependent on, where they are now and where they want to get to.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, I think the big thing, if you sort of want to understand how to effectively design agents and agentic software in sort of a little story, I would say the way that we think about it is you've got a massive forest and you've dropped a lumberjack into this forest, right? And this lumberjack has got a tool of some kind, and you've told him, right, what I need you to do is go through this forest and cut down all of the trees that you need, right? All of the trees that we've marked with a big X. Now, looking at that, if we then bring this into sort of more software and agents, the forest itself is the total amount of information that we've asked this AI, this lumberjack, this agent to process. The tools itself is the scope in which the AI can sort of manipulate this context, can manipulate the environment, and then the lumberjack itself has to now go through the forest and try and cut down all of these axes. So as a software developer and as an AI developer, you have a choice. Do we make this forest really, really big so that so it'll take the agent more time? And that, that's one thing. Do we then give the lumberjack a really big tool so it can cut down 5, 10, 15 trees at once? And you're like, that could be great if we have a really big forest, but it runs the risk of cutting down trees that we don't want it to. And then crucially, how many lumberjacks are we going to have for this forest? Now, obviously, every time you add in another lumberjack, you need to manage that lumberjack to make sure that he's not slacking off and that he's sort of actually doing his job properly. And so, that can be referred to as sort of, complexity. And so with Zavmo, what we've tried to do is build out a very, very small team of hyper sort of specific lumberjacks based off use case. And crucially as well, we try to not use large language models where we can, because we often prefer to use sort of more standardized deep learning neural networks because we found them to be just better at sort of more surgical implementations of AI. So for example, cognitive load equations and optimizing learning approaches and conversational styles and things like that are often, I would say, more appropriate to use deep learning tooling rather than large language models.
Okay, so there's just so much there. So first of all, so there's two things I want to go a bit deeper. The first one is this idea of agents, and the second is the deep learning. So can I just ask the first question on agents? So you said something earlier in terms of how many lumberjacks do I actually want to manage? And I think from a kind of layman's point of view, I'd love to know, is managing agents a similar sort of experience as managing people? So I had a kind of idea that you created an agent and that was the end of the story. But it sounds like what you're saying is actually managing agents and tweaking agents is an ongoing thing. I mean, I guess as the forest gets bigger,
Yeah, as the forest gets bigger, and crucially as you start to remove trees that used to be there but now have since been cut down, you need to inform the agent on that. So the big thing that we always try to do is keep the forest as small as possible, keep the context as limited and as small as possible, and to make sure that the lumberjack has got the right tool for the job, right? In sort of software development, we do actually call them tools as well. So that makes things quite easy. But generally, the binding would be where a tool is when you can take a large language model output and convert it into actual code. So get it to implement a sort of coded output in the form of like a function or something like that. So the big thing that I would always say, if you're ever going to build any form of AI system, you want to always start off with one agent, and you want to start off with a bit of data that it's going to manipulate and use. So that is the crucial thing, because it's very easy to expand out into a separate agent, but having to sort of scale down adds certain aspects of complexity, because now you're passing jobs onto other agents that originally didn't have them. And so now your total area of impact is much higher. Sort of similarly, you can always add someone to a team of software developers or to a sales team or something like that. But taking them away means that responsibility now has to be shifted off. The sort of thing that we always say in the tech team is we're trying to build onions, right? Start with a very small, tiny core and then wrap layers and layers and layers on it. And that way you can get maximal output with sort of total mean lower amount of randomness or perplexity.
Fascinating. Yeah, I think this idea of agents is quite new in terms of the evolution of AI, and maybe it's something that's not quite as well understood as it needs to be for those people that are.
So the core difference when it comes to, if you're really trying to figure out, okay, so what is the difference between when I'm talking to Claude or ChatGPT and an agent is sort of undergoing a task without a number of known steps. So for example, Claude, you'll say, hey, Claude, can you give me the latest news about glass manufacturing? I'm not sure, but Claude will just go and find any data it has and then return an output. Whereas an agent will set up and say, okay, I've been asked to find the latest news on glass manufacturing. That means I now need to go onto the internet. That's step one. I now need to check and look up glass manufacturing. I'm then going to get that data. I'm then going to formulate an answer, and then I'm going to make an output. So the difference is the AI itself is making multiple steps of thought or action. And thought is just thinking, and action is a form of using a tool call, using actual code to try and get an output before it will return a set sort of bit of information to you.
The other thing that I wanted to go back to is you said that the team at Zavmo tried to minimize the use of LLMs to prevent hallucination. Can you clarify a little bit more about what that means?
So the big thing that we tend to opt for is a smaller neural network. So when we talk about AI or artificial intelligence, there are tons and tons of different use cases of it, whether it's a self-driving car, whether it's an image generator, or whether it is fraud detection, or whether it's a large language model. So the big thing that often when it comes to the large language model AI boom is we've seen that as a very interpretable way to get an AI to have an output. So for example, if you say, hey, I really like pizza, here's what I eat every single day, what sort of food might I like? AI as a large language model in the form of ChatGPT or Claude can give you an output, and it might come across and be accurate enough, but there could be a day where actually it's a bit more random than we need it to be. It's what I would deem less precise. And also, if you're going to train or fine tune that from scratch, it's going to cost a hell of a lot more money, because it's however many 4 or 5 petabytes of data is required to train a ChatGPT, something like that. So when you then opt for a smaller, more specific neural network, whether it be a convolution neural network or a graph neural network, which are different types of architectures, you can get something that is much, much smaller and maybe only requires a few hundred megabytes to a gigabyte of training. And the benefit of that is obviously it's much cheaper. It will be far more precise because you've trained it to do a specific action. So maybe log based off a score, log when someone is or isn't cognitively loaded, or based off patterns, log when someone is or isn't bored of their learning.
So,
these sorts of things are much cheaper and generally more precise and accurate comparative to a GPT.
So this is fascinating. So if you build, so I've been reading a lot about small language models and how corporates and universities would want to protect their data and not necessarily utilize a large language model that scrape their data or could hallucinate. Where do you see the future in terms of small language models and private use cases of the AI stack versus large language models? Could you just explain a little bit about how, a university or a large corporate might be able to create an AI stack that is unique to that organization and over years becoming more personalized and more relevant to that context rather than...
So I mean, I generally hold a slightly contrarian view to this, especially with Andrej Karpathy is sort of like a well-known voice when it comes to AI, and so it's currently October 2025, and a couple of weeks ago he released, or maybe a month ago now, he released a sort of application called NanoChat, and it's a few thousand lines of Python code which allows you to, if you're running a number of GPUs, you can train your own version of GPT-3. And so this is sort of like a big step forwards in a more, I mean, it's still only for software developers, but a more consumer-friendly way of training your own ChatGPT. Now, to me, I think that there is definitely an avenue towards that. However, I sort of tend to look at previous markets and previous bubbles. And if you look at things like the internet, and if you look at computers, although we have opted to have personal computers, there is still a massive industry in the form of cloud networking, which is just computers in a data center. And currently, although yes, people buy a router, a lot of the infrastructure behind the internet is still sort of owned by large infrastructural companies. So going back to then, how would a university or how would a company build a really cost-effective and private system I would say actually you don't necessarily need to train an AI from scratch. That would be quite a complex thing. But actually what you do need to do is look at, well, which one of these AI providers are going to give me the best data protection rules and regs? And then how can we self-host a database that is side, and then from there essentially run everything through that? Because so that would be my thing. So everyone is currently sort of productizing large language models and trying to see how they can scale them. But I would say that's actually probably not the salve. It's actually how can we host our own data, and how can we input that into the large language model, and how can we get a license for a very private large language model itself? Or just as open source becomes better, how can we just use an open source model instead, like Mistral or something like that?
So this is really, really interesting to me. So this idea that, you've got, the big five, AI companies taking over the world, and everyone will use one of the big five AI companies. What you're saying is that you see the future where people might be going their own route, as the ability to create their own AI, whether it's using open source like Llama or, whatever, to basically create their own
I
personal
mean,
AI.
maybe. I don't know if they'll build their own personal AI, because to a certain extent that technology is sort of already there. Like you can with Llama, you can run what is a pretty good AI. The thing that I would say is it sort of likens to the internet, right? Would you like to have a slower internet, so no fiber optic, just still sort of running on copper wire or something like that, but it's yours? Or would you like to just use fiber optic? I think pretty much everyone would still opt, yeah, no, I just quite like to have a faster, smarter GPT.
Right.
And so the main thing is that I see as being super interesting is how do you scale personal database and things like that? That to me is actually the big infrastructural question that I think is sort of yet to be answered. You've seen, this is getting a bit technical, but we've seen a big rise in multimodal databases, which are building database systems that can store lots of different types of data, because AI has caused a massive boom in just general data creation.
Yeah.
Someone can just drum up a document just like that. So how do we store that? And I would say we already have case studies to suggest that people like that sort of style of AI interaction, most notably with Anthropic projects, right? With Claude projects, you can just build out a specific data set. With RAG, you can build out pretty much all AI companies use retrieval augmented generation, and you can build really successful things on top of that. And so whilst I would say like that's really good, but no one has really brought that to the consumer yet. So as far as the consumer's concerned, I would say that's the next couple of years. And then I would sort of say that as far as large institutions are concerned, if you would like a totally private on-premises model, that's fine. But I would say all of your tech stack, so all of your cloud SaaS solutions should follow that same model. So everything should be on-prem. So maybe that's a solution for defense. But if you're just a standard software as a service company who uses the cloud, there's no reason why you shouldn't just use a cloud model as a cloud AI model as well.
That's really interesting. So yeah, as you say, we've gone a bit techie, which I love, and I'm sure some of our audience will. But just to chunk up again out of the weeds, one of the things I always get when I'm talking to potential customers and existing clients for Zavmo AI is, what large language model do you use? And I know from speaking to you in the past, there was something along the lines, well, we can use whatever large language model you want. And that really confuses people, because I think that they think that, you pick a lane or pick a large language model and then you're sort of wedded to it. Can you explain a little bit about how agents within one application might use multiple models?
Yeah, so I would say the reason why generally people tend to pick a lane is one of sort of 2 to 3 reasons. The first one being, if you're in a large enterprise, you have to meet compliance. And so you're going to pick a thing, much like everyone will use the same company of VPN. Most people are going to use the same type of model. And the reason why we can offer multiple is because under our ISO compliance, when Rick and I did it, we included essentially every single model under the sun so that we can just adapt to clients. When it then comes to why more personal people use Claude, so for example, I know you prefer Claude, Juliette. That is what I would say is a mixture of skill. So like actually there is different prompting skills and styles that different models prefer. So with that in mind, people will just naturally move towards a model. The other thing with the increased use of memories and multi-chat persistence. So in Claude, if you say, hey, do you remember when we spoke about this? It can go look at previous chat, index it and find that data. It means that actually there is more reason for a user to stay on a model. So those are two reasons why people generally sort of pick a lane. When it comes to us, Zavmo's deployed to essentially use different types of models based off what it needs to do. And that wasn't our idea. That came from back in the day, maybe about 2 years ago. There was this system called LLM-Sys, which allowed you to gauge the total sort of complexity of a question, and then you could route a model to do that. And that was for like token efficiency. So that's sort of originally what we used in the first version of Zavmo. Now it's just a matter of being able to have backups. You know, if an AI model isn't performing very well, if it's not fully operational, or if just a user sort of prefers to use another one. So we very much sort of give it up to the user to decide. And then crucially, with that in mind, we just use multiple models for backup.
Fascinating. So that definitely has clarified a couple of things. Thank you very much. So one of the things as well is that when we have been discussing kind of client applications and AI as a whole, I know that there are a lot of people out there that we speak to that are, worried about AI. There's a lot of anxiety in and around AI, a lot of anxiety in and around AI is coming from my jobs, our jobs, there's going to be, the robots are taking over type thing. But whenever I speak to you about AI, it seems that you don't necessarily have some of these anxieties because you really understand AI. And it seems to me that when I reflect on our conversations, because you have a deep understanding of what AI is and how it works, you seem to kind of have that, I guess, appreciation, for want of a better word, that AI will create more jobs and create more opportunities because it's not actually a one size fits all, and it's not
I
actually
think it will
magic.
both sort of create them and destroy them as well.
Right.
Because I think AI is sort of like the internet. Well, it's very much like the internet, where if you just go and copy and paste a source, actually you're not necessarily learning or providing a good sort of overall deliverable. If you're just directly using AI, and I think a lot of people will be caught out by that. Definitely, there's been this rise. Andre Kapasi once again sort of called it this, but vibe coding, where people will just program using AI and not actually look at the coded output. To me, things like that's definitely led to an increase in bugs, I know, across sort of software, and I think it will lead to like a very interesting sort of job market, so to speak, because I've found that more people become better system architects and sort of from a skill point of view, but equally then are then unable to solve sort of quite basic coding problems. And when you take into account the fact that the average software engineer has about 5 years of experience, we're just coming on to the sort of 5-year mark where now the average software engineer has never programmed without an AI to help. So I think that shows a really interesting market. When it comes to something that's very job creating, I would say obviously we've just created an entire industry in the form of AI. I'm very positive about AI. I think the only thing that I worry about is when people start to empathize with it. That doesn't mean that the AI is self-aware. It doesn't mean anything like that. It just means that actually it's outputting a similar response to an AI based off its data set in the same way that, that it should. Really, if we trained it on different dogs' barks, it will likely continue to bark like a dog, but that doesn't necessarily make it a dog.
I had a guest on the podcast, Brian Moore, yesterday, and
Yeah.
he was talking about how amusing it is that when you try and challenge AI and even say, please tell me I'm wrong, if I am wrong, AI has a real problem in, saying flatly, you're just wrong, So the idea that, they have made AI in a way that makes you as a human.
I think that sort of almost leads back into the whole sort of like context thing as well, whereby so in software and especially in AI benchmarks, we have this thing called one-shotting, which is where just in one prompt can you get it to do something. And generally, what I find and what the dev team we find is the more you chat to it, the less likely it is going to tell you that you're wrong. And we sort of have a rule, which is you always want a clear context the moment the AI says you're absolutely right. So we try to, as a development team, we try to keep the context as small as possible and start as many new chats as possible. So literally, I probably go through maybe 15 to 20 chats a day. And there are two reasons behind it. When it comes to context, in terms of how an AI thinks, when you chat to it, what it will do is save that whole chat and then give it back into the AI. And then the AI has the full length of the chat, and then it has to predict the output. And then when you add another chat, it will take that whole thing with the additional thing and add it back in. And so when you go through that cycle and you ask it a question, the AI has more and more context of past sort of affirming thoughts. So it's far less likely to actually say, oh no, actually the last 30 minutes that we've been talking about, I now totally disagree with. And so this is what we call context pollution, where your context and your chat actually starts to become polluted. So the way in which developers and we sort of try to get rid of that is by keeping a very small context, keeping the forest as tiny as possible, so
Right.
that you don't get any form of pollutions. And so also my recommendation to sort of have the real insights, a one shot an insight and say, look, be a critical CTO referring to this, and this. Tell me about this. Is this a valid insight?
So,
Yeah.
sorry.
No,
So
that's it.
one thing I'm really curious about is I know that, in terms of the working population, you're at the kind of early start of your career, but I also know that you are a massive history buff. So I wanted to go back to this idea of industrial revolutions. And although obviously you didn't live through, or we didn't have a career when the internet came along, and certainly you weren't around, as I wasn't around when the plow was introduced. Have you got any reflections with regards to how this new industrial revolution that is AI, have you thought about them?
I do think about trying to compare AI to things like the internet and computers.
Yeah.
Because obviously you can draw a lot of parallels, right? And I think a lot of my technical strategy regarding Zavmo has sort of tried to follow that and focusing more on the idea that if we're currently in an AI boom, we shouldn't be building anything to do with a large language model because they're only going to increase and will become deprecated incredibly quickly. However, being able to build stuff around feeding into a large language model, building that as an infrastructural system, that will actually scale much more effectively, and the biggest thing that I would say is we're living in, as you say, the sort of boom of AI where more and more people are using it. It's very easy to get to run away with AI usage without a problem to solve. And so I always sort of like say form follows function. Like what is the actual thing that you're trying to solve? And then we should formulate something around that. And being able to build out solutions based off that means one of two things. Either you realize that you don't actually need to use AI for this problem. So it ends up being much cheaper and much less random. So you're more likely to get a standard output. And then the second thing is actually we can keep the AI very, very simple. If your core thing is, look, we want to build out an interactive co-pilot that can do data analytics for us, you can actually realize the AI stuff has to be, it can be very, very, very small. You can only have it as one agent doing one of 5 tools, and then actually all of the intelligent stuff can happen behind the scenes. And you can very much use a very simple AI infra, which is then going to be really cost effective and much, much cheaper, but get a much more solid and good quality output.
Yeah, one of the things that I'm not necessarily surprised about, but the journey in building out, Zavmo AI is still very rooted in the requirement for full stack developers. So although we're using, as you say, AI, it's not the majority of the code base. The code base is still, a kind of standard requirement for full stack developers as well. So I think that's kind of interesting.
Yeah, oh, totally. It's just a service. It's just a service. You still need an authentication system, APIs, and all sorts of things like that. And actually, the big thing that I would say is whenever we chat to people in sales calls, actually you realize the thing that they want perceived AI rather than actual AI. They want a chat interface because it's much, much easier from a UX point of view, and they want to be able to ask nuanced things. But whether that needs to necessarily translate into the core backend data services and all of that? Normally not, to be honest. And actually, the biggest thing that I would say is when you're building and when you're servicing a large enterprise for AI, it's a bit like flying a plane, where if you're off by 1 degree, 1 minute later, it means you're a mile away from your original trajectory. And
So
so
true.
being able to really actually either simplify what the AI stack is or build out the core sort of functionality, the core like infrastructure, that is much better. We have in the team this term called like byproduct engineering, which is how can we make it also, well, extensibility as well is the thing, which is when we build something, how can we make it really extensible? And crucially, when we're making it extensible, how can we make sure that's sellable? So it means that based off our design and our initial system architecture, it means even though it won't cost us that much, we get another couple sales by, a couple days of work. And that way, if you're building your system architecture in a smart and intelligent way like that, with sort of extensibility and potential byproducts in mind from a predictive point of view, actually you'll end up with a really good quality system.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I think it's also interesting when you were talking about, AI being, sold into corporates. Often when I'm, speaking to potential clients or current clients, there's this idea that, we're going to give them Zavmo and suddenly they're going to be able to, not have their L&D department. And I'm like, no, I'm
No,
sorry.
no,
It
no.
just does not work like that at
Yeah,
all. There's actually a huge amount of work and the same amount of work, just slightly different than if we're doing, a new rollout of learning management system.
yeah,
So
totally.
yeah,
And
I find that fascinating.
I think the biggest thing as well is if you look at the e-learning market in particular, we are in a position where we've got 20 years of data in the form of SCORM and anything like that, which makes it really difficult to migrate over to a totally native AI app. And
Mm.
that's why you've seen like in a lot of other e-learning companies will generate a small AI product in an agent that can query questions. But actually, there hasn't been any major infrastructural change, I would say, until Zavmo. And the biggest thing that we're obviously really glad about getting out of the way is the idea of being able to take in SCORM data, because that eliminates that whole issue. But I would say the biggest thing with AI is understanding the infrastructure and the data it sits on top of, because as we've seen, anyone can access and use ChatGPT. But how that's used is the real critical thing, and how that scales more efficient, more sort of importantly, because scaling ML ops, like machine learning operations for like onto the cloud, is a different level of complexity to just a standard machine as well. So being able to understand those are really important, especially when you're dealing with if you're deploying an AI to 50,000 people. When you deploy that, you need to account for 50,000 people not necessarily asking the right questions when they should. And so how do you QA for that, and how do you manage outages when you don't necessarily own the model itself? These sorts of things are all sort of areas whereby actually you need to be really careful of it, because now not only do we need to worry about the quality of the servers, so making sure that we have multiple availability zones, good enough redundancy, but also we need to make sure we have a backup for the service that we are running on the service that we're renting, So you sort of have a double layer of redundancy that now you have to look for and sort of pay for, and things like that.
It sounds like we're going to be keeping you busy for quite some time, Cosmo.
Yeah.
So I just want to move on to potentially a difficult question, but in terms of the future, so even in the time that you have been building Zavmo, which is, roughly about two and a bit years,
Mm.
the AI landscape has changed. You spoke briefly about the arrival of agents. You've probably seen, other kind of big structural changes in the kind of AI ecosystem. But if I asked you to say, what are we going to be experiencing in AI, let's say in 10 years' time? Would you have any ideas? Would you like to make a guesstimate?
I think the interesting byproduct of this has been when we talk about AI development, we're actually, to the lay, we're actually just referring to large language models and then image generation. So what I'm actually really interested to see is how has this hype translated into other deep learning models that are different in architecture, getting a lot more funding and reaction. Crucially as well, the thing that I see happening is, like I said, we've had a massive boom in output in terms of data output. And at the moment, the only way to have an AI stack that has a singular set of single database. It's by using a multimodal database that comes with, at the moment, a massive performance cost. And so that to me are the core two innovations. Like how is AI development going to translate into deep learning, into the more non-obvious AI things like OCRs, which is a model used to sort of look at, like, observe things. That's sort of one thing. And then the other one being looking at how our infrastructure naturally needs to change to sort of support a big upheaval in what is standard data storage. The other thing that I would say on that is I think we're going to have a real change in terms of how we train models. If you look at the current sort of big billion-dollar AI companies, Invisible and Scale AI are all about training models. And I think the real money is going to be made in how do we train a large language model through optical data. So being able to look at things, and then it can train that in terms of a large language model output, because that is way more efficient than having to get tons and tons of data.
Yeah,
You know,
no,
if you,
fascinating.
the amount of data that we can perceive through our eyes compared to our ears is much, much greater. So I think those are the sort of core three.
Yeah, I mean, really fascinating insight. I want to ask you, I recently wrote an article for my newsletter on LinkedIn, and it was looking at cultural sensitivities in and around AI. And what it did is it was a study done by one of the big five accounting firms. I can't remember which one, but it looked at how comfortable people are country by country utilizing AI. So in the UK, we're in the sort of mid 40%. So, 40 something percent people think that AI is a good thing. But, the larger majority think that AI is going to come for our jobs and the robots are going to take over. Whereas you look at somewhere like India, for example, and their comfort factor with AI is, 86%. And in China, it's even bigger. I wanted to ask you this because obviously you've had the opportunity to live in the UK and you've had the opportunity to live in India. Have you got any thoughts as to what this means in 10 years' time? So if a whole country, and in the USA, indeed, their comfort factor and using AI is only about 24%. Just spitballing, what does that mean for the future for those countries, and also for the companies and the people working inside those companies, from somebody who's lived in many countries?
I mean, I think the interesting thing with India is obviously there's a billion people,
Mm.
and of those billion, there are over 50 languages. So from in Bengaluru, you can go and you can talk to most state governments, and they have got a policy on building their own AI model to service a native level sort of a large language model for their native language, whether it be sort of Kannada or Gujarati or something like that. So to me, that's really interesting, using a large language model to specialize in for translation and things like that. And mostly the purpose is to distribute across sort of lower economic, output areas, so that then there can be sort of essentially freer education across that. And obviously not everyone in India speaks Hindi. And so actually that to me is super interesting. When it comes to the UK, I would say we are in an interesting medium where there's only sort of 78 million of us. So we are 10 times smaller. And also all of us speak the exact same language. And there is a sort of far more institutional level of standardized systems and education and things like that. And so I would sort of say, much like the general population of the world, as we start to scale these AI models with a global outlook, the UK culture will sort of represent the global population, in the sense that we are, only 78 something million, 80 million people, comparative to 7 or 8 billion in total. The big thing that I always move back to is at the end of the day, we are training a model to predict the next word. And if there's less data about us, naturally that will be the sort of the case moving forwards as well. I think what is interesting is potentially looking at how political outputs and how political AI gets in the future. Definitely, I think we're going to see a rising in advertisement within AI. I think that's a really interesting thing. Essentially, everything we've seen with AI, with social media and the internet, I think likely will replicate over to AI. And I'm interested to see how advertising, data protection, and things like that is going to look in the next few years.
That sounds to me like another podcast, Cosmo. I mean, we could literally spend
Yeah.
another hour on that. I want to just talk a little bit about the opportunities that you say you've seen in the market. So one of the things that you've said is a real kind of growth area, and in the future is this idea of data and data storage. And I know that you have a real passion for this area, and you have indeed started your own little side hustle. And I'd love to know a bit more. It's clear that you think, that's going to be a requirement for the industry. Can you tell me a little bit more about Tussle, what it is, why you decided you wanted to, go on this quest, and what kind of problem it solves for potential customers?
Yeah, totally. So in sort of like one line, Tussle, and I'll give you a one line technical and a one line sort of non-technical. So Tussle is a system level polyglot storage engine. And essentially what that means is if you want to store data, it doesn't matter the type, I can do that really efficiently. That's sort of what Tussle is. It's a multimodal and multi sort of storage type database company. And so at the moment, when you look at the current landscape of AI, looking at Zavmo, we've got 6 databases that we have to manage for the different data types. So whether that's for full-on authentication and then general user data, and then you've got chat history data, then you've got caches for fast responses, and then you've got a recommendation engine. There are all sorts of these things which result in sort of 5 to 6 database systems. Now, obviously you want to keep auth separate, but that is really costly, and also from a DevOps and sort of server management point of view comes with a lot of time and effort. So there has been this rise in the last sort of 10 years of multimodal databases, of a database that can manage multiple database systems. The unfortunate designs of this, though, has been that they haven't actually really redesigned the storage engine. They've just put a Band-Aid over it in the form of wrapping these things in a larger software to query all of them at once. And really the reason why I started Tussle was out of frustration with how these multimodal based databases don't solve the problem, because they max out at something like 10 to 20,000 operations per second, which means that as time goes on, it's actually going to cost more, and it doesn't change anything to do with sort of complexity. You're just going to have a really big server and a really big database. So at Tussle, we then went away and we redesigned a storage engine totally from scratch. So using sort of very limited dependencies, using literally from service base level code of Rust, we've redesigned a storage engine, which means you can store anything from graph to longer docs to key values to like SQL, so like structured data, or to just regular indexing. And so the difference is that you get the same benefits of storage when it comes to what you're storing. So like SurrealDB, like these other multimodal databases, but whilst SurrealDB caps out at 20,000 operations per second, we can comfortably do 500,000.
Wow.
And so my background is in deep learning, especially with graphs. So I put in a lot of effort into designing our graph sync, and that can do just over 50 million graph traversals. So the next closest thing to us can do 1 million. So
Wow.
we have accidentally become a really performant database company, and so we're just launching at the moment. But the thing that we're hoping to build out is a really simple, really cheap, really fast database that can store any data that you want. And the biggest thing that we're doing to position ourselves better to the consumer is de-skilling what a database is. Because I've said these things like SQL, KV, graph, index, but what actually is that? And actually being able to have someone just create, without any skill, a personalized and optimized database for you, like a Google Drive that is totally free on your device that you can store and plug into an AI. It means that we can't touch your data. You can store whatever you want. And it means that, crucially, you can improve AI experiences without paying anyone.
Yeah, I mean, when I saw it yesterday, I was really impressed. For somebody who, obviously, my background is not in tech and I don't really understand a database, I looked at the 4 steps that you've got going on in Tussle, and I was really impressed at how quickly, the database was, able to be created and how quickly you could recall stuff. So we're definitely going to put, links into where people can find out more about Tussle. It sounds
We'll do
fun.
Zavmo first.
Yeah.
Zavmo first. We're releasing next month, so I'll comment all on that. But yeah, no, thank you. Yeah.
So look, I want to sort of round off with some personal questions. You know, from my point of view, when I hear you speaking about, you know, AI and, you know, all of the things that you have already created and you are currently in the process of creating, it is quite remarkable what you have achieved at 22. But what part of this journey that you've been on does nobody else see? We can obviously see the achievements, what you've built, but what are the things that maybe people don't appreciate about all of the things that you've
Well,
done?
I think just sort of obsession really, I think is the thing. I think like the thing that I always point out to my developers, I say my developers, you know, they're not mine, but the team, the dev team is actually, and if you want to learn anything, it is just a matter of hours into a task. You know, I pride myself in making sure that I'm always working every single day, and I'm just very obsessive about a subset of tasks, which is understanding and building, scaling AI products for sort of enterprise use case, and then the data that goes along with it. You know, I like literally there is nothing intelligent or smart about me other than the fact that I've decided to dedicate X many thousand of hours into looking at how we scale AI data. Like that's it. And it's, you know, it's the same with picking up the guitar. You know, like I like to play guitar and actually, you know, just do enough hours of it. It's there. You know, I think the biggest thing that I've sort of come to realize is like getting really, really good at stuff is really boring because all you're doing is the same thing again. It's sort of how do I do it enough times so it's not that I don't get it wrong, but can't get it wrong. You know, practice makes permanent, not perfect, right? And the steps that I would say if you wanted to get really good at AI, it would be figure out what your goal is. So when you're saying like I want to get good at AI or something in general, what is it that you actually want to do? Figure out that goal and run in this sort of cycle of 3. If you don't know what to do, it means that you don't know. If you're finding something difficult, it means you don't know what to do. So therefore you need to go and learn, right? If you don't know what, and that's sort of it really. It's like if you don't know what to do or you don't know how to do it, you know, or you're finding it hard, it means you need to go back and learn something and then reassess your goal. Normally, if you're finding something that is still too difficult, you know, you can either go back, learn it again, or you can make the goal smaller. And that's it. You just iterate through make the goal smaller or go and learn. And that way you just always have something to do. And that is make the goal smaller or go and learn. And that's it. The less you think, weirdly, the better. Because, you know, instead of saying, I'll do it tomorrow, I'm going to do 30 days, just don't even plan that far ahead. Just start doing it. And then the less you think, the better. You know, confidence comes from building up a requisite amount of evidence that you are who you say you are. That's not my quote, that's Alex Hormozy's. And so just build evidence to show that you're good at a task, and then you do become good at it.
Obviously, you are very young to be the founder of multiple, you know, companies now. What do you think the biggest misconception people have about, you know, quote unquote, young founders?
I don't know. That's a great question. I think maybe people are too polite to tell me. I don't know. I think probably there aren't many incorrect misconceptions. I imagine, because like once again, I don't know, this is a guess, but I imagine there have been enough young founders where we can gauge a pretty good stereotype. But I think like the biggest thing you want in a founder or a CEO is just obsessiveness. You know, I think like as long as your manager is more obsessive than you, I think you're okay. If you're more obsessive than your manager, then I think then maybe you should start to look at other places. But I think obsessiveness is potentially maybe one thing. You know, in life you have to choose what to suck at, right? And so that.
Okay, so we're gonna, you know, wrap up the podcast with the final question that we ask everybody, and at such a tender young age, even though you have achieved an extraordinary amount, I'm gonna ask the same question that I ask everyone at the end of the podcast, which is when you think about your story so far, all of your, you know, 22 years, what do you want people to feel when they hear the name Cosmo Denny? Think, feel.
I think to a certain extent, potentially obsessiveness. I think like I quite like that. I think I mean, hopefully they think I'm polite. I think polite and obsessive, I think is my two things. That's probably it. Yeah. I don't know. But polite. polite and obsessive.
Fantastic. Well, look, Cosmo, it has been an absolute delight to have
Oh,
you on the,
thank you for having me.
and we will definitely be inviting you back again. There is so
Yeah,
much
I'm looking
wisdom
forward to it.
in that brain of yours. So yeah, thank you very much for being part of the Zavmo journey, and thank you for imparting some of your wisdom on this.
Oh, no, it's been a pleasure. Thank you for having me on. So yeah, no, thank you. Right. Well, yeah, thank you.